So, hi everybody, this is Steve Falcon Napier. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. Today we're going to have a discussion about the human energy field. Now, this is something that Tim White brought to our attention, and he sent me over a lovely diagram. According to this model, and let me go ahead and slide something that I found on this into the screen here, but this is at buffer.com. I do not believe that is the complete URL. It's not, but if you go to buffer.com and do a search for the 4 elements of physical energy, how to master them, I think you might find a lot of background information, what we're looking at here. So, and Tim, you can certainly unmute if you want to chime anything in as we're doing all this. But the 4 types of energy are your emotional energy. How happy are you? Your mental energy. How well can you focus on something? Your spiritual energy. Why are you doing all of this? And the only one he hasn't mentioned is physical. So I want to break down all the elements of physical energy as the most important foundation. Okay, and so this is going into what really brings us that physical energy on which everything else is going to arise from. Okay, so something well worth reading, but I just wanted to do a quick little look at what those types of energy are and where they resonate on the change grid. So let's kind of slide that out of the way. And so the mental energy was about figuring things out. Is that the words that they were used? Let me just scroll over there. Mental energy, how well can you focus on something? Now that's interesting because when I first thought mental and what mental means to me, I would go like, well, that would resonate very much with the analytical energy. That would very much move us into our mind and our, cortex, etc. And so I was going to put it down grid. But when it says, how well can you focus on something? It brings up a question. Do we believe that the best place on the change grid for you to focus on something would be where on the change grid? Would it be more of a driver, an expressive, an amiable, or an analytical kind of energy? Well, when I go focusing on something, that tells me there has to be something on which to focus. And so that feels like some question already exists, some issue already exists. So, and now I have to come in and focus on that in order to resolve whatever it is. If there's no something, then there is no opportunity to focus. So, I think that that feels very analytical to me, and perhaps a little bit of a driven analytical because I would think if you're focusing on something, again, there is an intention, there is an issue. And so I would say to you, Tim, that that is most definitely a primary analytical energy with a secondary driver kind of an energy, because again, they want to do something. The very far down grid, what they would refer to as the mental, maybe that's what they would do. I don't know. No. We got to stick with it. The analytical is most definitely content with knowing and knowing for no purpose, no reason, no real drive. So
Yeah,
yeah.
see, I would agree with you. I mean, that's the way I was seeing that when I put
Mhm.
this together and sent it over to you.
Yeah,
Um,
because unless you got that driver element, then what's compelling you to focus on something? Now, it did use the word well, so that tells me they're thinking there's some kind of a skill or some sort of a how well can you focus on something? So I feel like there's a standard that's being implied, and somehow or another we're comparing ourselves and comparing the individual that we're observing to find out how good of a job are they doing at focusing on something. And so even that further strengthens the thought that it is very much a downgrid kind of a thing. Looking at the engagement rings, though, I would say to you that if we go too far downgrid, where this mental energy, hey, Brian, we're looking at the human energy, what was it called? The human fields of
Field.
human energy fields. Anyway, and they define mental energy as how well you can focus on something. So definitely something that's down grid. I agree, but I do believe that we are beyond awareness. We need to be at least in some sort of an intention existing. And I would wonder if ultimately the best job is coming coming out of this focusing on something with a solution or whatever to bring us to that something's most desirable conclusion. I almost feel like it could be primarily a driver energy with a secondary analytical. Or maybe it's going to progress through that at the very beginning of your mental energy being summoned forward, you're going to be a bit more downgrid because that is a capability you have mastered that's now being pulled into some sort of action or opportunity for action. So I feel like there's going to be a little bit more of a intention and hopefully ultimately the actual engagement, the following through on the focusing of the something. All right, so gentlemen, you've unmuted. So again, we're just trying to figure out where does this mental energy where does this mental energy reside on the change grid? Thoughts about it, Boris, Brian?
Where does this come from?
This is actually from a model that Tim stumbled across. Tim is not in a great spot for background noise, but he can certainly unmute and give us the highlights. So Tim, go right ahead.
Yeah. So I actually went and sat in the car to reduce
Oh,
the
good.
background noise. But yeah, Brian. So I have a client that has had preliminary conversation with me regarding his team of direct reports, and his concern is with regard to their energy. We have a follow-up meeting scheduled for this week so that I could get deeper understanding of what he's looking for. But that's what led me to beginning to look at energy and in relation to the change grid. And so I did send T a link of one article that I was reading. And actually, I also listened to a podcast where a gentleman was talking about human energy field. And so I've just been looking at different sources, trying to see how might this overlay with the change grid, because I would
Yeah,
love to be able to have them do some work with regard to the change grid. So, Brian, that's really where it comes from. That's sort of the backdrop.
Because
excellent.
I was asking because this is Dr. Jim Lear. When I first came to the States, I did some work with him at the Human Performance Institute in Orlando, which teaches professional athletes how to manage mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional energy. And actually, in the back of his book, The Power of Full Engagement is what he called the full engagement system. So I took the same concept and was teaching high performing executives how to manage those same energetic portals using sports medicine, energy medicine principles and concepts, how to manage those same physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual energy. I just call it a corporate athlete program. That's why I was asking where did it come from, because like in the back of his book, he actually has those same energetic things that he's looking at. And his co-author of that book, Tony Schwartz, who co-wrote a book with Donald Trump that he had to sue him for, he actually goes out. He has an international consultancy that teaches, I think he calls it the Energy Project, and he teaches high professionals how to manage their energy around the world, literally.
It's all very interesting.
Yeah.
And I have chatted over to you guys the link to this article, and lo and behold, it does, in fact, start off attributing a quote to Tony Schwartz. And so this is a good little starting point to look at because it does give a quick definition of each of the four types of energy that they're proposing, but then it does a deep dive into how you can make sure your physical energy is best managed. And it is no doubt the foundation for all the rest than to work functionally, because ultimately you're a machine. And if your machine is not really functioning at its best, then it can't do what it needs to do. So I did chat the link over to this exact page that I'm looking at as we do this. For those of you who joined in the call a bit later, we got engaged in this conversation a few minutes before official start time. So it was all recorded, but so it might be worth listening to the first few minutes again. But basically, what we're trying to do is figure out where do these energies, as defined by the human energy field people, resonates. And I'll tell you now, I certainly believe that it does. But our hope is that always that while we might be able to learn something from integrating someone else's map of humanity, what can we add to it? And so I want to jump to there and say to you that I believe that there is a fifth energy that needs to be added, which would result in a shifting of one of the other energies.
Interestingly, T, I see these as integrated, right?
Well,
So
yeah,
like
I
I'm
mean, they're all
thinking,
you, right?
right, exactly. And I think from the as a physician, right? So when someone comes in with physical symptoms, there's a mental aspect to that, and even an emotional one. Like take for instance, someone's given a cancer diagnosis. There's a lot that's connected to that diagnosis that they're experiencing that impacts even the physical. And they're studying this now in terms of there's anesthesiologists and some of the research that I'm working on in nanomedicine, nanotechnology, AI. And they're looking at the belief system and
Mhm.
how that people can start to um, mitigate pain they're experiencing by just their belief system. So
Mhm.
that's a mental and emotional aspect. So I see these as integrated, but however, how you experience them may move you up where you're experiencing more emotion that can
Right.
override some of the
Yeah.
physical,
And
that
I
kind
think,
of thing.
if you think about the fifth layer, the change grid, we say these are the different energies someone can have around performing a particular task. So we talk
Hmm.
about we use that word for, well, I don't know, we've been doing this 30, 35 years, 40
Right.
years. We need to come in. So we know that when we're looking at human behavior or we're looking at our perceptions or whatever, we know it's energy. A human being is just an electrical moment. Right? I mean, you slap us all together. We're just a bunch of atoms and little electrons, and somehow or another they all came together to be each of us, but we are energy. And so it would make sense that we always want to know where are we as in terms of managing our energy. Let's jump to kind of a more gifted question and just say, where on the change grid is the best place for you to do the best job of managing your energies or of being in this perfect energy? Where is that?
Well, T, that's what the gentleman in the podcast mentioned, and I think I may have read it in one of the articles, but he said instead of managing our time, that we should focus on managing our energy.
Managing our energy.
Absolutely. Yep.
And
And
so
that's empower.
right, isn't that nice? Because we're talking about this is the world of tension management. And certainly tension is one of the ways that our energy is either impacted or is impacted by. But I think that there's a lot of other ways of describing that energy than simple tension. And that's what I like about seeing models like this that are trying to give us a better understanding of what's going on. But to get back to Tim's original question, the mental energy is most definitely something that is going to contain analytical and driver energies. And in what ratio is going to determine where exactly they are on the change grid. But bringing the engagement rings into the discussion, I would say to you that ultimately for that object of how well can you focus on something, for that something you're going to need to move up to a little bit more driver energy in order for that execution to actually occur. Anyone agree with that? Thoughts about that?
Hmm.
No?
I would agree.
All right, so let's
Hmm.
take a look at, I guess we're saving physical because that's what most of this article is all about. Let's look at emotional energy. Now, there's defining emotional energy as how happy are you? And I'm sure they have a far more in-depth breakdown of what emotional energy contains, but we certainly know that emotion is not just about being happy, but I can tell you from a great deal of things I read earlier on, in specific, the philosophy of value by the Japanese educator Sunisaburo Makaguchi. I know we've mentioned him many, many times before. One of the things that he says from the very beginning of the philosophy of value is that the object of the human experience is to create happiness for ourselves the way that we define it. So no matter what we're doing, no matter what we have to do, ultimately, we're all just trying to be happy. And so I do recognize that happy is a fantastic definition, or rather, a destination on the emotional highway, but it certainly isn't telling the entire story. So if I said to you, let's just deal with it as it has been specifically listed, where do you think happiness lives on the change grid? Huh. Isn't that interesting? Because I can kind of build a case for all of them, but I do feel like one seems to be its home base. So anybody want to throw? What do you think? Where does happiness live on the change grid?
That's interesting. For me, I think it depends on time and place, if you will.
Yeah.
Where someone is at that given moment.
Right, because if by happy I mean I'm jumping up and down and hooping and hollering and we're having a big party and celebration, I definitely feel like that's more upgrid. But if happy is just being at peace and content with where you are and what's going on, then that feels more downgrid to me. So you guys thoughts
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, that's the trouble with studying, or the challenge, I should say, with studying emotions in general,
Right.
right? Because emoto in Latin means movement. So when
Yeah.
they're studied in the lab, they're not studying what we call feelings, they're studying triggers.
Hmm.
Because emotions are literally designed to pass through the body. So, in
Hmm.
other words, they carry information that cognitive faculties don't. And so, if you pay attention to them, they should heighten your reasoning capacity. That's
Yeah.
how both work together. But when you're overwhelmed by one and the other, then you're not balanced in your decision making. That's where that stress becomes important because now
Mhm.
you're overriding cognitive faculties in
Mhm.
terms of the perception and making what's called a reasonable decision.
So are you suggesting that um, unless
See,
the intensity of the emotion is sufficient, we aren't going to actually get into motion around it? And
No,
I'm
you will get into motion, but it's like the whole idea is to, if emotions are designed to pass through because they're really a signal, right? So
right.
what Tim was just describing, the context and how you're experiencing things matter. And that's why in a lab, they're always trying to see what parts of the brain are ignited when you're so-called happy or you're experiencing certain emotions, because that
Okay. Yeah.
context matters.
Well, so let me throw this out there just to find out, because what I'm trying to toy with is the idea that the ideal human energy um, field would be contained within the green circle. And it
That,
might lean in particular ways, but it doesn't really give much thought. And again, I mean, I know no more about their work or the program than what we've just all glanced at together. But it would seem to me that if they haven't already started to address it, it's a wonderful place to address what happens if the emotional energy becomes so dominant that the other three energies are suffering one way or another. So what happens when our energy is out of balance? If that's what this is talking, what happens if we get to be too physically, too much emphasis on the physical energy or the mental energy or the spiritual energy? What ends up being compromised in
see,
doing that?
I think the key word that a couple people have mentioned now is balance.
mhm.
And for me, the whole experience of happiness resides within that green area that you're talking about,
Yeah,
clearly.
yeah.
But I think that there's degrees of happiness, and if you're truly at peace at all times, which I can't imagine somebody being That would be just unbelievable experience. But you'd be dead center. You'd be right where you are right there.
And I'm thinking when it comes to happy as kind of like a foundational state, it's the exact center. That's where you want to be, the place of balance, because part of what being, it's interesting because if you think about it, there is a certain detachment that is most definitely occurring in the center. Might you be detaching from your own evaluation of your own current state? I mean, would the person who's at the center of the change grid even think to themselves, I'm happy? Or did that thought really occur at some other energy? Why was that? Why did that come to be? So I think it's possible to be very happy and totally unaware simultaneously.
Yeah, yeah,
That bliss is blind. I don't know.
exactly. I think these
So
are things that when we talk about emotions, I think these are things that, and I forget the professor's name that had the Meaningless Institute. These are things we're supposed to cultivate in real time,
yes,
right? And so they're fleeting. So to Boris' point, I don't see people, even monks are not happy 24/7.
well, right.
So, these are things that we're
You
really
don't look
meant to
happy at all.
cultivate in real time, but oftentimes we're overwhelmed because of
Yeah.
the imbalance.
Right. And that again, that's another layer of the changer. We talk about being at the exact center is, uh, you know, uh, the kind of where our real goal is from a spiritual perspective. I just gave it away. I want to shift spiritual to the center, and I want to come up with another word for what's really happening over here. But nevertheless, there is this kind of feeling that I'm in a very good spot. Even though I'm not at the center, if I could live my life inside of the green circle, what a really nice life that would actually be. And I could see like happy would kind of occupy this whole green area. But if I go beyond the green area where the real work of life has to be done, at least temporarily, my happiness state is going to be disrupted, modified, set aside, whatever, depending on what that something is that is pulling me away from my world of well-a-balsam bliss, into whatever else is really going on. And I can only hope that it's not going to pull me into some crisis sort of mode in a danger zone, one way or another. So I do think you guys are right that this model is definitely resonating with the thought that it is something that's mapping to what we already have, and it has the center is where we really want to be. But back to Tim's original question, why would physical be out grid? I can feel why emotional would be upgrade, why mental would be downgrade. Why do you guys think the physical energy, and you can anything you assume it to mean, it means it's what you're doing with your body. It's about how vibrant you're feeling and healthy and all that good sort of stuff. So where do you think on the change grid you're going to need, let's put that, need that physical energy to step up?
Yeah, so that's definitely our grid, I think. And
Yeah.
metaphorically, like in value science, when they're talking about moving from where you position yourself to create the greatest amount of value, it
Mhm.
follows intrinsic, extrinsic, systemic. And they
Yeah.
use metaphorically this idea of heart, hand, head,
Yep.
and in that order. So it's like the physical is what you put your hands to do, but it comes from the heart, which is the centering. So
Mhm.
it starts there, then you move out, then head, you systematize things. That's how you integrate fully into things that are even um, bigger than yourself, or like the from self view to like world view. So
Yeah.
I see the physical as putting your hands to actually doing something.
All right. And so how does that resonate with what we've already got in the world of change works? That's definitely the driver energy, but no
So
mistake about it.
T, I'd like to pose something here that Brian's mentioning. To me, the physical has this component of control. Like I can take these actions, I can control these actions. Versus when you go to the left to spiritual, that to me, the further you go in grid, the more it seems like I have a lack of control, and it's more of an external experience than an internal experience, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So Brian and I were talking about a totally different topic a couple days ago, that I had this other mental model I was sharing, but one of the words in there was social. And I was using the word social to depict our interactions with others. And I think that there's some component of that in grid where you're saying spiritual is more maybe to the center, and then there's some other word maybe to describe it. I think that's the area of where you lack control, and it doesn't seem to align with the ability and challenge in my head.
Okay, let me address that as two kind of separate things. First of all, I love the idea that that would be like a social quadrant. In many of the four type models, social is one of the identifiers they use, and it does tend to find itself in the in-grid side of things because the in-grid is all amiable and it is all about caring for others, etc. So that resonates absolutely perfectly. And it does make me feel a lot better about this idea that the whole outcome, if you will, of arriving at the exact center of the change grid, being able to enter that state whenever you wish to do so and remain there wherever, whenever you, for as long as you want to be, boy, that feels like you achieving some level of spiritual evolution beyond the confines of whatever physical plane we tend to live on. I didn't want to glorify it too much, but you get the idea. I think that you get to the center of the change grid and you're transcending. There's something else that's really coming into play. That's an energy in and of itself that may not be on the change grid, but is definitely of the change grid, or the change grid is of it. You may do whatever you wish to do with all that metaphysically. You get where I'm going. But social definitely resonates with amiable, and that definitely feels like what's going to be happening in here. To the other point, Boris, the one thing to kind of recognize about the change grid is that as we shrink the change grid towards the in-grid side of things, so as we literally take the 12s and squish them down to 11s and squish the 11s down to 10s, or not even squish them on top of each other, but shrink the whole diagram, just shrink it, shrink it, shrink it, shrink it, shrink it, you'll see that inside of the in-grid quadrant is an exact replica of the entire change grid. So they have their own change grid. They have their own scale of 0 to 12, but a truly social types idea of a 12, or rather of a 12, is nowhere near what the real world of 12 could actually contain. Their world tends to be a bit smaller in scope and focus and that. And so it makes sense they're taking care of themselves and others, because those are about as primary as we're going to get. But yeah, and so getting along with others, the social aspect of what's going on, nothing's truly threatening them in any grand sort of way, and they haven't had to go out and become truly masterful over anything in particular, but they have enough in order to take care of most. And that creates a very different reality that would not be a bad place to live, quite candidly. Yep. Okay, thoughts about that? David, you're also unmuted.
Yeah, no, T, I agree. There are, I mean, when you look at the change grid, you can look at not just the layers, but the elements, the sections of the change grid, and realize that there's a lot going on. I think that social, I see social as an in-grid kind of energy,
Yeah.
but I see it all over the change grid.
Well, truly, because every social person we know, use the hallmark example of a mom or whatever. Oh, you got to believe you see plenty of the emotional parts and the physical parts and the mental parts going on. But again, it's because the whole thing is shrunk down to overlay on the in-grid quadrant. And so that's a really interesting thing to think about. We usually don't talk about the whole idea that you can scale the change grid. You can also shift it. So if you guys think about your personality, what is essentially you? Can you start by telling me whether or not the essential you has more of a driver, an amiable, an analytical, or an expressive energy? Yeah, I mean, I'm going to believe you can do that.
Yes.
You know enough about yourself. And if I said, and secondarily, you know, what's your next level of focus? Is it going to be on the we'll use that as the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, the mental? You know, how are you going to overlay these? Well, that's going to tell you, if you will, at least down to the energy map that we use in reading change grids, the epicenter of your change grid. Okay, stop for just a second and really just soak in that for just a second. The change grid, the big one that exists on the universal kind of level, has a spot on it for everything and everybody. No one has a change grid that's going to stretch to the extremes of all of the possibilities on a change grid. You with me on this? You're a subset of the full range of possibilities in human expression or human behavior. Can you guys kind of accept that, or do you recognize that? Yeah. And so you each have your own little epicenter. And from your epicenter is generated an entire change grid. Your epicenter is the center of your change grid. And so things that might be very, you know, a driven physical kind of thing for you may be totally overwhelming to someone who might be more on the far Ingrid side of things. And so I've rattled that off. All of to just say to you that for a while, we had a whole list of things we would have put into like an advanced ChangeWorks training program or an advanced master stream program. But honestly, there just really wasn't sufficient audience for it to justify fleshing it all out. You know, there was no real income generating potential from it. So we just thought like, okay, it's something that's really just for people who like to think about what we've done and how we're continuing to try to flesh it out and exercise it. So yeah, for that, you should know that you can squish the change grid and you can stretch it and you can skew it into all different proportions. But from your epicenter, you own your full change grid. How big it is, how tight it is to the center, that's for a different exposure exploration. But that's what's really going on. So again, back to Boris' original comments. Yeah, the people that are very social, they're still a full human, obviously, but they're just tend to live in a smaller kind of a world. So does that resonate with what you've been exposed to, Boris?
Yeah, sort of. The only different dynamic is that um, if you've got an individual that is struggling in their social interactions with others, specifically family, you know, children, spouses, that sort of thing,
Yeah.
that they tend to kind of like in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they tend to like not be able to focus on anything else in their life because it just overwhelms their
Yeah, right.
experience.
Because well, on the hierarchy, it's something that really is of the highest points on the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Or the
Mhm.
yeah, the lowest, depending on which one, whose diagram you're using for the hierarchy. Yeah, really
Yeah.
interesting. So again, you know, Tim, I guess we've given you a very roundabout answer to the question, but it most definitely overlays on the change grid. As they've described it, I feel like it's living inside of the green circle. Um, and maybe even if we put inside of the green circle our own full change grid. Oh, why did I even just mention that? Don't do that. But shifting a full change grid to the center, the epicenter, is just pulling it into a healthier kind of range of human behavior and understanding and expression. So it's all good stuff happens inside the green circle. May you all live many a day inside of the green circle.
I wonder, T, is this I see these kind of like in when we were studying the spiral dynamics,
Oh, yes.
because there's a centering when you come to spiritual aspects, right?
Yeah.
And when you operate from that, you're operating out of the expanse of who you are instead of at your expense. And there's a unique difference. Like the work that I'm doing with Boris, right? So when I said I went out and did this corporate athlete program, I've been interviewing people for retooling and refueling was the name of the training. And so I'm interviewing these high performing people, different demographics, different industries about how they're managing their energy. Like, what do you do before work? How do you, if you have any recovery strategy? And I was telling Boris, the way that people work today it to me is analogous to an athlete who's already worn him or herself out before the game. Like they don't have any energy for the
Right,
actual game.
right.
Like, when I'm asking questions like what you do before work, and they load up on 6 or 7 cups of coffee, and
Yeah.
there's no preparation for like the work, then what you do after work. Oh, I binge on Netflix. Like they just want to disengage. So there's no recovery for, the next day or for the
Right.
next thing.
So they're
And these are
depleted.
all trading rhythms. These are waking hour rhythms that you're meant to control or regulate, as we say in pension management perspective. And no one's really doing that. And now burnout is classified by the World Health Organization with the ICD code. Like
Mhm.
it's called an occupational phenomenon. So you can now go to the doctor for burnout, just like stress. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, that's not just an organizational thing. Some people get burnout, whereas other people don't. So there's a
Well, some
lack of
thrive in that environment.
exactly.
Right. I mean, again, go back to the thought that everyone has their own epicenter somewhere on the change grid. And if your epicenter is already pretty far out grid and up grid, you are busy doing things. Because that's what people who are on this part of the change grid, that's what their life is filled with, the doing of things. I mean, look, they're living in a place of engagement. Now, again, we're talking in those past few statements as though this is an entity, this is a whole person. We all know that there are lots of things that happen in life that pull us out of type because we have to go take care of things going on in life. And so we can't always live in this one thing. We respond to different activities in a very predictable kind of way, but that predictable range of behaviors is still going to be confined within the scope of our personality, or not too far outside of it. I know that our personality is always under a negotiation. Yeah.
Gee, so I'm thinking about the comment that Brian just made, and I agree with that. And the way I see it from an HR lens perspective is that's why employee assistance programs can be effective, because sometimes leaders misread employees and think that poor performance is connected to competency. And it could very well be that it is not related to competency, but it could be related to one of these energy levels.
Exactly.
And so it could very well be that that employee is simply out of balance with regard to their energy. That's why I really like that quote that I mentioned earlier, where the gentleman said, "Hey, let's focus on managing energy." And I can certainly see that applicable in Brian's work around the sports world.
Yep. So
In fact, less than 4% of organizations actually model for that idea of managing energy in terms of engagement, in terms of productivity. Not many organizations actually design that. Like that's an actual design issue, an organizational design issue. It's one thing to say, hey, we want high performing people. It's another thing to say, okay, what is the structure? How do we structure things for that kind of functionality? So it's a concept, that's taught and not
right.
many people use it.
So think about that as something that is part of some corporations, or at least in the educations being offered to corporations. Where on the change grid should an organization be if you want to have, be, do, and feel all the things that these organizations say they want to have, do, be, and feel? Where does that live on the change grid? Because if it's all you're using energy management, I use tension management. Life is tension management. Life is energy management. It's the same model that we're resonating here. That means it has to live somewhere. And I think that's the problem if we're looking at certain emotional models, getting back to this one and to what Tim was saying, as they've described it, it all lives inside of the green circle. But there's a whole world. Far more of life is lived outside of the green circle than inside of it. And some of these models that I've been scanning are only talking about rather central sorts of things, foundational sorts of things. They're not talking about where these things go awry, when there is an imbalance, and how does that come from? Or where does that all come from? So I think that there is I'm going to say, a lot of work to be done beyond what is being described for us in these with these sorts of things. Now,
I've got something I'd like to pose to the group as well. I think that I've made a statement before that successful people focus on, successful people manage their focus, unsuccessful people manage their time. And why I think that that's kind of a relevant statement here is that the challenge I see a lot of times is there's a lot of real estate to cover between spiritual and physical and emotional and mental, and trying to in a day-to-day activity perspective address all these things and be a whole person and live a really full life. And I think that can be overwhelming to people. And so to the degree that somebody is able to shift from their let's call it that purple center, their sweet spot, and shift out, address some physical things, address emotional things, and then go back. There's a natural gravity that brings you back to the center. And to the degree that you can't do that, and the further out you try, like if you're trying to win a triathlon, right? You're so far out on the physical side, it's going to be really hard for you to be jumping over and trying to do things in your spiritual domain.
Well, right, because the situation at hand requires something that's only entitled to 25% of your overall energy. Now it needs 50% of your overall energy. Well, it's pulling that energy from these other areas. And now they're totally depleted, and sooner or later you're going to run out on the physical side as well. Now the whole system is depleted. And in fact, the quote you guys are sharing, it's right at the top of that article that I've actually chatted over. So manage your energy, not your time. That's Tony Schwartz. And it goes on. But what this whole article is really all about is about the physical energy. And so I want to talk briefly about that, because this is something that I think is unique in the world of tension management. So it's one thing to know where someone is and know where they should be. It's one thing to be able to read a change grid and help someone understand where they're at. It's another thing to be able to move people around. And so I thought that it was interesting that this particular model says that ultimately your physical energy has to be front and center, because without it in place, you don't have a chance to be able to better handle your emotional or mental, or what they're calling spiritual. I would like to add social and spiritual energies to that. So they're saying this is what you need to watch. You need to watch your nutrition. Okay. Lots of people talk about the importance of nutrition. You need to, you guys could have predicted at least 3 of these. Fitness, that's absolutely right. Got to get some cardio in there, get some oxygen flowed through your body. And you need to get some sleep, good quality sleep. That's all great. I don't disagree. And then I get to this one, which is what you guys were talking about earlier, renewal. Renewing your energy levels within the day. How do you go about avoiding these collapses in energy? They're using a different metaphor here about race cars and saying you got to do pit stops. So you got to stop for 8 seconds once in a while they change your tires and everything else they do at a pit stop. And anything that's encouraging me to take a nap, I have no argument with whatsoever. So, thank you very much. Reading is what puts me to sleep, so that really does well. So, in fact, usually reading pulls me into meditation, which makes me fall asleep. So I think I have them covered, but I think it's interesting going back to, again, they've done a bit deeper dive. You guys are welcome to do that. I chatted over this article link to all of you already. Which though gets me to the question, before I can begin doing any sort of quality change work with myself or with another person, do I need to make sure that there's something happening out grid? Now, beyond the physical things they've talked about in terms of nutrition and sleep, and what were the other ones? Nutrition, sleep, fitness, and whatever that renewal thing included. Do I need to go through that? Do I need to have something going on out grid before I even have any reason to handle emotional, spiritual, or mental, or before I can handle? How can we do this question-wise? How about if I said, if my physical energy is now where it needs to be, how does it affect my mental energy? If my physical energy isn't where it needs to be, how might that affect my mental energy?
Well, it probably would be substandard, tired, sluggish.
Sluggish,
Yeah.
yep. I might get sloppy, carelessness, things like that, if I
Yep.
don't have enough physical energy to do that. And so this model would imply that before I start doing upgrid maneuvers, I need to make sure people have already got the physical energy element taken care of. So can I add upgrade maneuvers onto someone who is already mentally depleted if they're also physically depleted?
Mm.
Hmm. Do you have to heal the body before you can heal what ails it? I don't know. These things tend to be more occurring in someone's mind, where
Yeah,
these
all
things are
those
occurring
things
in
they
the
mentioned,
body.
those are things you should be doing anyway. Like, in other
Well,
words, they feed the body, right? So nutrition has a chemical reaction in the body. So that feeds. Sleep is the body's ultimate reset button.
yeah.
All systems need a reset, right? And then we talk about, again, renewal. This is where people depend on like willpower. And willpower is literally designed for you to shore up for when you need that extra,
Yep.
kick. It's not
Yeah.
meant to just be utilized just to utilize it. So
No.
these
Well,
are things you
and
should be doing anyway.
you mentioned earlier too that one of the things people do now, we know it as a form of renewal, is they drink coffee throughout the day. All right, they're trying to renew their energy. Unfortunately, they're doing it pharmaceutically. But nevertheless, that suddenly resonated with me as a renewal kind of an activity. So taking a quick nap, a lot of people talk about having that lull in the afternoon. And so maybe you go for a walk. People will meditate at certain times of the day. All of these to me feel like elements of the renewal activity for
Mhm.
the physical side of things. So, but I just thought it was interesting if I have someone, let's say given, and all of you think about all your clients, you have a client who is simply, honestly, accurately, physically exhausted. There's no energy left. And they are in a situation where mental energy is required or
Mm.
emotional energy is required. And again, shift spiritual to the middle and put social. One of the most draining things someone can have to do is something social. And so, nevertheless, this individual is so exhausted physically that they are. I don't want to take it away from as a question, but their abilities are being affected, or their
Mhm.
outcomes are being affected mentally, emotionally. If you don't have physical energy, what happens to your emotional state?
It's compromise.
Well, tell me how it might manifest. How can you tell when a little kid is exhausted?
They
They're
get
gonna
upset
act
very
out.
quickly.
They get
Mhm.
upset very
Yep.
quickly.
They
So
act out.
the ability to modulate one's emotions or moderate one's emotions is compromised as we become physically tired. So
Yep.
certainly if I've got someone who's got emotional issues going on in their life, I may very well want to ask myself, do they have the physical requirements being met? And I like this article, but I'm not suggesting they've come up with the only set or a complete set, but I do agree completely that there's this physical energy that needs to be in place before the other ones have any hope of succeeding. So can you
Well,
think?
T, the interesting thing is engagement is outgrid. So don't you think that a person needs to be engaged?
Mm, are you talking about engage? Do I need to be engaged in order to deal with the emotional issue? Or
Yes.
yeah, well, yeah. Otherwise, I'm dealing with something I have no engagement in. I'm avoiding it. Really, if anything, I'm fleeing from it. I'm ready to fight against it. I don't want it at all. These two energies are in conflict, just like the driver energy and the expressive energy have their own conflicts at the extreme, but they also have an amazing harmony in the middle. And that'll hold true everywhere we go on the change grid all the way around it. Um, so how does being physically exhausted affect my ability to handle a social requirement?
Well, your wife says, "Hey, I need you to do some chores around the house." Your kids want to go to the park and play. I
Yeah,
mean, you just don't have the energy to do it.
right. And so it's going to undermine that. And if it's a business kind of thing, you got to go to a party. I could see, yeah, if I go to a party, and I won't interact with anybody at all.
Mhm.
Or I'll find one person I know and capture them for the whole evening talking about whatever. So yeah, it takes energy, physical energy to be able to do these other things. So I can certainly see that regardless of what an activity may be on a change grid, one of the things I might want to add to my overall change work strategy is to make sure that I at least check in on the person's physicality, physical requirements before going further. So if they say, well, I'm not sleeping well, I'd like to explore, why aren't you sleeping well? Is there something emotional that's interfering with it? Is there something social, mental, physical, or spiritual? What's going on that's interfering with your ability to sleep? I don't know, but that if they're going to tell me they have a deficiency in one or more of these physical elements, I can kind of see how I would kind of naturally start to explore that. You guys agree with that? Do you do the same thing? Yeah.
Yep.
If they're exhausted, they're exhausted. Um,
Exactly. So that they're what they're looking at is from an energy perspective. It really talks about these biological rhythms that we all have.
mhm,
So, a lot of people talk about circadian rhythms, which are 24 hours, and so that deals with sleep, but we actually have four, right? So ultradian rhythms is less than 24 hours. So that's your waking hours. And
mhm,
what the research shows is, again, how you transition from one activity to the next matters just as much as your engagement in that activity. So
mhm.
typically, for most people, it's an hour, 2 hours. And then the energy starts to deplete depending on how much cognition, how much emotion is involved.
Mhm.
And so that's where this reset comes in. But for most people, when you're trying to toil 12 hours a day, this is why there's such high burnout amongst
Sure.
physicians and other people in the healthcare space right now. Then that compromises the patient relationship and these kinds of things because they're drinking,
Mhm.
like information and water, like from a fire hydrant
Yep, yep,
with,
yep.
with no reset. So you have all these
So,
different biological rhythms to manage. And if you don't do an adequate job with them, you don't have to tell your body that it's tired. It will shut down for you.
right,
And
right.
that's how you see people fall asleep at the wheel.
And I agree completely. I think it's interesting that you're describing what happens if I'm outside of the green circle on the outgrid side of things. That's what's going on where I am so consumed by doing something, there that I am ignoring the others. Actually, what I'm doing is I'm grabbing energy from the others in order to be able to focus on moving this further of that direction. Um, would the same thing be happening upgrid and ingrid and downgrid, or does the physical pathway ultimately um, hmm, yeah, that's something if someone is physically set, what happens to emotional issues in someone who has good physical um, energy? Are they better able to handle it or less able to handle it?
Better.
Better. And spirit, with social, if it's mental, if I'm physically capable, I will do a better job of any of these. Um, so that to me, it's feeling more and more like this physical energy is something that needs to be addressed first and foremost. Do we do that in the work that we do, or do we
No.
just give it a superficial kind of a questioning? I mean, Brian, you're a doctor. Do you do you tend to focus on just the physical, or do you find yourself getting pulled into emotional, spiritual, social, mental sorts of discussions um, rather than taking care of the physical check boxes first? How does that work?
Yeah, so it's like I see the physical, right? So you see the diagnosis, you understand they're experiencing something. I always was interested in what's behind it. That's where the neurobiology comes in for me. Because again, when I was doing rotation in emergency room, that was my favorite thing because I call it the war stories, right? So you see people who have physical demanding jobs, construction worker, law enforcement, they come in and especially like construction worker who severed their hand. And you're hearing the story as to how this happened. You've been doing this for a while. You know how to work the machines. Oh yeah, I was physically tired because I worked a double shift or I worked a triple shift. I needed extra money. That wasn't a physical thing. That was a mental and emotional thing.
Mhm,
So,
mhm.
he was just not the cognitive was hijacked to really pay attention for something that he's been doing X amount of years. And this kind of thing happens all the time when these systems, energy, are not balanced.
All right, so this is really interesting. Yep, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say to that point, you had asked earlier in the discussion, where does the organization live in this conversation? And I think that question leads us to some of the answers that we're struggling with in organizations, because I think organizations, to David's point, are outgrid, and which is probably why you rarely see a chief human resources officer become a CEO, because it's just the human factor is just not something that organizations value. Stock prices go up when they announce that they're going to downsize. And I mentioned the EAP programs, but there's rarely, unfortunately, sufficient focus on the well-being of the employee and how these other energies connect to that physical energy, because all they want is the results.
No, but Tim, that's why I think we're so important, because a lot of other professionals focus on other things. I think this is where we have an opportunity to really help shine and create balance and facilitate dialogue that results in real results.
Yes.
Yep. Well, now to both of your points, let me just throw in a couple of observations on how this integrates onto the change grid. The first of all is, where does the corporation live? I believe the corporation lives out grid, but outside of the green circle. So they are slightly amiable, but mostly they are out here. They are expressive drivers, driven drivers, analytical drivers. They're up here. We have full engagement. This is the organization. The organization wants full engagement. It wants us to get out there and make it happen one way or another, figure it all out. This is what it's all about. As Tim can sadly verify, the part of an organization that is absolutely vital is the HR side of things, the social side of things. And inside of the green circle, there's a big chunk of that available to the outgrid energy, but the corporation tends to view that kind of care inside of an organization as being an unavoidable legal requirement or something like that. So, Tim, can you verify that people in the world of HR have been undervalued for a very long time or not understood? I know he can. He's muted at the moment. But all right, we all know that this is happening. So I just want to point out that we know that it's happening outside of this. Brian, does that resonate with you with what you were sharing?
Yeah, so it's more transactional. It's not relational.
Right.
Like
right.
I even talked to recently, just coming back from Central America, we're working with healthcare leaders. And their whole thing is, people are going to do what we tell them to do because they're getting paid to do it. And I said, well, that's a transaction.
Yeah.
So why would you expect engagement, full engagement for someone who's disconnected? Engagement always starts on a personal level. If you don't feel that safe, secure, happy, and healthy, why would you expect full engagement out of them?
Well, and to your point, they've just invited into their organization, the individual you've described is a driven analytical. They want someone who knows what to do, knows how to do it, and will get it done. But look how poorly engaged they are. They're actually down here in intention for the most part. They're power apathy in intention. And so that's who they import. And
exactly.
they try to push you over here or whatever, but they're this internal.
But T, I think from a business standpoint, I think what we're describing is the current status quo and not where business is headed. I think in the future, if they're going to be successful, they're going to have to look at this through a completely different lens. You think about the demographic shifts and what's happening. There's the Great Resignation may be just the starting point of that conversation, right? But in the future, we're going to see less and less people available that are going to need to serve the needs of society in a much greater way.
Yeah.
And robotics will replace a lot of the manual work, but they're not going to replace the intellectual work that most organizations are going to need.
You are
And
correct.
those types of individuals, I think, you're going to have to embrace them and engage them very differently than they have in the past.
Yep, I agree completely. Well, to that point and to Brian's point earlier about spiral dynamics, I want everyone to kind of look at the green circle for just a second. So really understand that this circle, I want you to stand in the exact center of the circle. And then I want you to turn that circle into a bubble, into a ball, and you're standing in the exact center of the ball. Can you guys do that?
Yep.
Okay. And so you are standing inside of a giant ball. Now, because gravity is involved, you can't stand in the exact center of it. So you're going to be on an interior surface of whatever gravity is pulling you down. You with me? You're inside of a ball. And so that means that you can walk along the sides of that ball in any direction, roll that ball any direction you want it to go. And we've probably played with such things before. We know they're out there, right? You guys can all imagine one of these bubbles that people can get inside of and go whatever direction they want to go. Well, the implication here is that in order for you to grow, you can't stay at the center. To just stand there inside of this bubble of happiness might feel okay for a very short while, but very quickly your mind is going to say, I need to, and the answer usually is move, I need to get going. It's implying, if you will, that there is a preference for rolling the ball in the outgrid direction than there is for rolling it upgrid, ingrid, or downgrid. So natural movement we know is downgrid. If you don't do something sooner or later, you're going to get bored and complacent and ambivalent, etc. But if you can get that ball rolling, or you want to get that ball rolling, the thought is that what direction are we rolling it? So how many of you believe that the human experience is one in which people, even happy people, are happiest when they're rolling their ball outward?
Toward something. That's kind of like life in general.
Something, right? You know, we often think about outgrid corporations as being business accomplishment or financial accomplishment. This is a place of accomplishing anything.
Yeah.
Anything.
Yeah.
So
I call it the process of continuous value generation, right? That's the essence of life, is to add value in some way to your life.
Yeah. Yep. And so you're thinking then that's something that's very primitive, it's predictable, it's part of human nature to want to roll a bubble outwardly. And I'm not saying, again, I'm just rolling this, I'm just shifting center slightly outgrid, redefining what a 6-6 experience is. You know, something you find 10-10 today may be redefined down the road as the new 6-6, and a whole new outgrid world is opened up to you. That's the thought. Your grid is a subset of the grand change grid, and as you get to certain places on it, you can see more, and the possibilities grow with you grow. So that was metaphysical. Anyway, I like the idea about needing to lean outgrid. Thoughts about that before I throw in two sentences about spiral dynamics? Or yeah, good so far. This idea we're rolling our bubble out grid. I don't think we're just rolling it out grid. I think we're rolling it up a spiral. I think there is growth that we're going through. We can't keep going one direction. We have to go that direction. Do you guys know the top of a Hostess cupcake? It has that little white squiggle on it. You with me? That's, I think, what is really the movement. We're moving outgrid, certainly, but we don't make a beeline for it. We are working through stuff. We're growing, we're gaining, we're expanding, which means we're going through all of these things. Spiral dynamics, for those of you who weren't on those calls long ago, they're all up on our YouTube channel, but it's a model that basically visually depicts a tornado, if you will. And at the bottom of the tornado is humanity long ago, and it gets assigned a color. And over the course of time, people have worked their way up this spiral, getting further and further up to the top of this tornado shape, where things are that much bigger, better, brighter, whatever the case may be. And some say, well, it looks like a tornado. It's actually a very tall cone, not cone, a very tall cylinder. It's all really the same. Well, we came along and said, no, we believe as people move up the spiral dynamic, and this is again, they're growing, they're gaining. So as they do this little curlicue thing going out grid, what happens is that the diagram needs to be inverted. The work is happening faster and it's more and more focused on achieving, giving up the physical emphasis, giving up some of these other things in order to achieve higher levels of spiritual growth and awareness where there's greater balance and harmony and happiness in the world. What they're doing is really moving up to the very tip of a cone. And so each rotation around the spiral dynamics should happen in less time. And that's one of the things that people who study spiral dynamics have identified. What they're on a quest for is that happiness in the middle, that spiritual sort of fulfillment. What did Maslow call it? Hierarchy of needs, self-actualization. So this is all part of it. This is all movement towards that center. I just don't want you to think that the center is a single place that everyone gets to. You bring your center with you as you move your entire life across the grand change grid.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently now I've put you inside of a bubble and given you a little bit of a circus sideshow act to do. So we'll give you ramps to go up. That'll be fun. Anyway, there you go. All right, questions, comments before we finish for the day?
If I was going to redraw this, I would put spiritual energy on top of the purple bubble in the center.
Yeah.
And I would put social on the left where you have spiritual.
Absolutely, I agree.
And then connect them. So like you can even have arrows going to them. So that circle, like it's just going around, because that ball, like you're bouncing around there. And that makes sense because life itself will dictate to you, if you listen to it well enough, will dictate to you how and where you should be moving.
Right.
But again,
let me throw one thing. Oh, sorry. I just want to throw one thing in because I think, Brian, you'll resonate with this and you'll include what you're saying. When I think of social, emotional, physical, and mental energy, I think of things that are very much of this earth. Whereas someone moves into the spiritual level, it's as though they're a spaceship now taking off from planet Earth's surface, and they can see more and they can do more. So that's where you were heading, Brian. So I was kind of wondering.
Exactly. Because I tell people all the time in the anatomy, when you cut open the brain, you don't see what we call mind. You see a physical brain, right? But yet there's some things that just I can't explain.
But there's a physical structure that's obviously
exactly. That's feeding it, right? So something is feeding this physical structure, and it creates conditioning and different thought processes.
Well, now you're opening up a whole new world, because I forget who said this. This is many years ago on one of our calls, but they were talking about how every thought that a person has, the human mind never forgets anything. It just becomes more difficult to retrieve stuff, but it's all in there. And I always said, but what form does it take in the brain? How is someone able to remember something so vividly so many years after the fact? How was it, in what form was it stored? And then people say, well, it's electrical, it's whatever. It's like, no, there's something, it might use electricity, but there is some structure, there's some way that these memories are actually coded and captured and held forever. And I don't think anybody knows the answer to that, but it makes sense that such a thing exists.
But it does reprise the memory. So in other words, if you open the brain up again, there is no storage unit for memory.
Right.
We know what systems reprise it, and this is where emotion comes in, because emotional memories like 9/11 tend to remember more vividly than if something is more neutral.
Right.
So we know emotion plays a key role into enhancing any kind of attentional faculties and cognitive faculties like memory and those kinds of things. So
how is information captured and stored and retrieved? That's what it's all about. But it's happening somewhere in our head. It's happening. It's happening. It's happening. Hopefully we're not an old punch card system. If you guys are old enough to remember those. Okay, we're done for now. So thanks everybody for joining in. We'll talk again soon. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Good day, everybody.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Already.
Bye-bye.